Hello. So this lesson is about diffusion and osmosis, and hopefully it will help you understand these two topics a little bit better. Both diffusion and osmosis are examples of how molecules move into and around cells. By the end of this lesson, hopefully you'll be able to define and explain how diffusion works in the cell membrane and also define and explain osmosis in the cell membrane. A few vocabulary words before we begin. The word semi-permeable means that certain substances are allowed to pass through, but not others. So kind of like a screen. If you think of the lab activity we did where you put the rocks and the sand and the macaroni on top of each other and only the sand was able to pass through, we would say that that screen was acting like the cell membrane and it was only permeable to the sand, meaning only the sand could pass through. This cell membrane is only permeable to certain substances. So if we look at this yellow block here, what substances is this membrane permeable to? If you guess the purple, green, and yellow molecules, you're right. Why do you think that those are able to pass through? It has to do with their size. So most of the time when the membrane is permeable to certain substances, it's blocking out things because of their size or charge. And we know that our cell membranes of the eukaryotic cells, like plants and animals, prefer for small, non-polar items to pass through. The rest of them need extra help. Another important vocabulary word for this unit is the word concentration. When you see the word concentration, keep in mind that it means amount. So anytime you see the word concentration, it means amount. If there's a high concentration of particles, it means there are a lot of particles. If there's a low concentration of particles, it means that there's less. You also might see the word concentration gradient. When we talk about the concentration gradient, you can either move along or against the concentration gradient. When you move along the concentration gradient, that means you're moving from high to low concentration. When you're moving against the concentration gradient, it means you're moving from low to high. Diffusion is the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Diffusion is the random movement of particles, and it does not require any additional energy. This is a natural movement of particles. So this is how particles prefer to move. If you think about being at Disneyland and being super, super crowded with a bunch of people, and then you heard that California Adventure had no waits for lines, you're most likely going to naturally drift to the area where it's less crowded and go to California Adventure. Molecules are the same way. So, for example, when you put a drop of dye and you put it in the glass of water, you probably notice that eventually the dye spread out. This is because we had a high concentration of dye molecules in the dot and a low concentration of dye molecules everywhere else. And so naturally, the dye molecules want to spread out. This is the same way that air freshener works. When you spray air freshener in a room, it works by diffusion. These are examples of diffusion that don't even require a cell membrane, but even when there's a membrane present, the molecules are going to do the same thing. So thinking about this, is diffusion the movement along the concentration gradient or against it? If you guessed along, you were right because molecules move from high to low concentration. This is an example of diffusion across the cell membrane. So you can see these are a bunch of little particles. The extracellular space would be outside of the cell. The intracellular space would be inside of the cell. And then the lipid bilayer is the cell membrane, as you know. Looking at this picture, where do you think the molecules are going to travel by diffusion? If you guessed into the cell, you're right, because they have to move from high to low concentration along the concentration gradient. Now we'll take some time to talk about osmosis. Osmosis is the same thing as diffusion, but it's specifically referring to the diffusion of water through the cell membrane, aka water is moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. The osmosis is the type of diffusion that works without a membrane spanning protein. So it's still passive, doesn't require energy, and it's still simple diffusion without the use of a protein. We'll talk about the proteins in a later lesson. So if you think about how water would travel with osmosis, you'll be asked to figure out how water is going to move. So to do this, we're going to talk about what direction the water is going to go. I like to draw what I have and what I'm given and then figure it out from there. So it says inside the cell, we've got 20% water. So I'm going to draw my cell and I'm going to pretend it's in a beaker of water. And I can see here, I've got 20% water. Outside of the cell over here, I have 80% water. Whatever is not given is going to be 100%, is going to add up to 100%. So in here, whatever's not water is going to be 80% other stuff, and whatever is not water is going to be 20% other stuff. And in this question, it's asking, where does the water go? So in this example, I am going to see that I have 20% water inside the cell, 80% outside. The water is going to go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration via osmosis. So it's going to go into the cell. And I can draw a little arrow there. And then here I might write into the cell. Oops. It's the first time I've used this. Let's see. I'll erase that. There we go. It's going to go into the cell. Let's try number 3. So I'm going to draw what I have again. Go back to black. And inside the cell, we have 25% sugar. And outside the cell, we have 75% sugar. So in this case, we've got 25% sugar. That means the rest is water. So here we've got 75% water. And then outside the cell, we have 75% sugar. Oop. Can't backspace. %75 sugar. And then we have, that means we have 25% water. So the question gives us the terms of sugar, but the answer is asking, where does the water go? So we had to figure out the water. Notice we just did that by figuring out what adds up to 100%. So water is going to go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So water is going to leave the cell. And so for this, for number 3, I'm going to put that water is going to travel out of the cell. There we go. Try these other examples on your own and see how you do. The last thing we're going to talk about is in terms of our cell membrane transport is going to be, so now we're going to take a look at our cell, and we are going to take a look at our dynamic equilibrium. This is the rate of molecules moving into and out of the cell when the rate is equal. So basically, your molecules are going to move in or out of the cell until you find an equal rate.